Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please kindly take your seats. The third session is set to begin in 5 minutes. We kindly request all speakers and panelists to take their places on stage, ensuring they are ready to begin at the scheduled time. Thank you. We are now ready for session 3, focusing on how climate change will impact public finances and sovereign credit risk. To share this session, please welcome Mr. Abdurrahman, Deputy Director at AMRO. Mr. Abdurrahman, over to you.
So let me invite the panelists come on the stage. Katerina, Oscar, Kirill, Yader, and Sebastian. Still need to wait. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us for this third session of this seminar on how will climate change impact public finance and sovereign credit risk. Earlier today, in session 1, we look at how climate change is affecting the broader macroeconomy, impacting growth, inflation, productivity, as well as the long-term development prospect. Then, in session 2, we focus on the financial sector, discussing how climate change could create new challenges for financial institutions as well as markets. As we have seen, climate change is no longer just an environment issues. It is now a key factor in shaping economic stability as well as financial decision making. Now, in session 3, we shift our focus to public finance and sovereign credit risk, a topic that brings together the macro and financial sides of the climate discussion. As we have seen together, governments are facing rising costs from climate-related damages and the transition to greener economies. At the same time, investors and rating agencies are starting to consider climate risk when assessing sovereign debt. How government response will influence not just the budget, but also their ability to borrow and maintain credit ratings. So we are fortunate to have 3 excellent speakers in the session, each with 20 minutes to share their works. First, we will hear from Catherine Segini, macroeconomist and modeler from Bank of France, who will present a model that looks at how climate change damages and mitigation costs affect sovereign and debt sustainability. Next, we will hear from Oscar Valencia, principal specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And then we have Kirill Lemba, economist at the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development. After the presentation, we will have a 20-minute fireside chat between Iader Giraldo from FLAR and Sebastian Brioso, Managing Director, Head of the Sovereign and International Public Finance Rating Team in Latin America, S&P Global. With that, let me now invite Katarina to begin her presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me here. It's my first time in Latin America. I'm very happy to be here. I'm presenting now a paper that I wrote at the Swiss Finance Institute and the University of Geneva. Now I'm at Banque de France, so the usual disclaimer applies here. So these are my views only and not of Banque de France. So the subject of the implications of climate change and mitigation has already been touched a bit, especially also a little bit on adaptation in the previous section, and the importance of the private sector intervention if we don't want that falls entirely on the fiscal budgets. At Banque de France, we are now recently working on that, but disclaimer, this paper is not going to be at all about adaptation, something that might be missing. But still, I try to give my contribution analyzing both the impact of climate damages and of transition policies respecting the carbon budget on sovereign debt sustainabilities of a certain set of countries. So notably not Latin American countries and not Asian countries, but European countries and the US, Canada, Australia. So let me begin. Oh. Not sure that works. Okay. So the issue is the issue of these two companions challenges that to be addressed together: managing the risk of growing public indebtedness and dealing with the consequences of climate change is well known, has been well known in a policy institution for a while, both from the climate damages point of view and from the transition point of view. And there's been discussion of a revision of the European budgetary rules in order to take into account especially transition cost. And at the IMF, there is discussion of including especially climate damages consideration in the public sustainability framework, and has been touched by Christine also in the introduction. In this paper, to my knowledge, the first academic paper that tried to estimate what would be the national fiscal limit in advanced economies under the transition cost of implementing the Paris agreements. So fiscal limits. What I'm talking about here is not what is going to happen to the debt to GDP ratio. I'm abstracting from that, but what I'm talking about is what's going to happen to the maximum debt to GDP level that would be sustainable, okay, for every country. So this takes into account both economic cost of reducing emissions and or climate damages, and also, in an abstract way, the degree of political coordination in the transition. So most of the literature, I'm going to be quick on that, has been on the impact of climate damages on sovereign borrowing cost. The general implications that it increased sovereign borrowing cost. Stronger institutions or efforts in diminishing climate vulnerability has been proved to decrease this adverse impact on sovereign borrowing costs, together with mitigation efforts. Regarding the quantitative modeling, one of the important contributions in this domain is the introduction of climate consideration and stochastic debt sustainability analysis. It has been done by many institutions. An academic paper is, the first one is by Zenius, by Stavros Zenius, and then he actually proceeded with many other papers on this topic, which are very interesting. In the institution, both the IMF and a joint paper that I have with my co-author Stefan Des, we use dynamic general equilibrium models to take into account how different mitigation policies impact the macroeconomy and also sovereign debt sustainability. Again, this is different because in these papers, these two contributions on the sustainability analysis and on dynamic general equilibrium model, they looked at, they tried to look at what's going to happen to debt to GDP. Here, I look at what happened to the maximum debt to GDP ratio that would be sustainable. We are talking about sovereign debt sustainability. What does it mean? It means that sovereign debt is considered sustainable if the debt to GDP is lower than this fiscal limit. This fiscal limit can be quantified in different ways. In this paper, it is quantified following an involuntary default framework. And that also implies the choice of countries that have been chosen for doing these exercises. So here we exclude the possibility that the country can decide to strategically default on its debt. It's going to default if basically market investors do not want to roll over debt anymore, or they ask for enormous compensation in order to do so. And this framework, this involuntary default framework, is usually applied to advanced economies, even if there might be some applications to other countries and maybe to a kind of IMF consideration, given that, to my knowledge, I'm not an expert on that, but talking with people that work on that, the impression is that they actually, when they consider the possibility of default of a government, they tend to not think about a strategic default, but more implied by market borrowing cost. So why not? Might be also applied to other countries than the one that I used here. What is the fiscal limit? I already explained. It's maximum debt to GDP ratio that a government can accumulate without losing its repayment credibility. And the main determinants in the literature are the distribution of the growth rate, the risk-free interest rate, and future potential primary surpluses. So I'll just go to the model and I present the results as I'm going forward. So a bit of math. So basically, the numbers, the fiscal limit that I'm going to show here is this. I don't know if I can point. Yeah, is this dt, this small dt. Ooh. Okay, so basically this is the fiscal limit. Okay, so that would be the maximum debt to GDP ratio. It represents the face value. Okay, So this would be the debt to GDP ratio that maximize current borrowings for the government, okay? These borrowings, B of DT, are of course the ratio between the face value DT and R of DT, the government interest rate, the sovereign interest rate. This interest rate is the ratio between a risk-free real interest rate and 1 minus the probability of default. This is a standard model, a traditional model by Collarda, Bibber, Rocher that quantify fiscal limit for advanced economies. So how can we basically incorporate climate consideration into that? So the default condition that defines this probability of default, I'm not very good with this pointer. So basically it is defined in this way. So we have default if the growth rate is lower than this ratio. In this ratio, we have at the numerator what we have to repay, the face value of debt to GDP, and at the denominator, the resources to repay. So alpha represents the maximum primary surplus, so basically the fiscal capacity of the country, and BMT plus 1 represents the future maximum sustainable borrowings that are available to the country to roll over debt. Okay, so basically this growth rate can be basically extended to take into account climate consideration. Here, for example, mitigation cost. So basically this eta would represent the contribution is a reduced form to represent the contribution of emissions to GDP, and therefore the ratio of the future contribution to with respect to today's contribution represent the contribution to the growth rate that was matter for fiscal sustainability. So I'm trying to be quick. In order to define that, we use basically I wanted to abstract from a particular policy consideration. So which kind of if you're using carbon pricing or if you're using other policy solutions in order to implement the transition. So I used basically this paper by the OECD, which allows to basically capture the cost of reducing emissions for OECD countries, represented by this by this beta, which represent the short-term abatement cost for every country. Okay, for example, we're going to see that for Italy is higher than for France. Okay, so let me go to the data that I use. This beta, as you can see, represent the short-term abatement cost. Then the mu and the sigma represent the historical distribution of the growth rate, whereas the mu 0 and sigma 0 would represent optimistic representation on the distribution of the growth rate under a complete transition scenario. So in the long term, what would be the growth rate and the average growth rate and the volatility of for a given country? These are what this mu 0 and sigma 0 are estimated for the OECD. The main scenarios use actually mu and sigma in my paper. I do some sensitivity analysis with lower and higher numbers. But what I am assuming here when I'm saying that these represent also the future growth rate of an economy which has done which has completed the transition, basically I'm relying on the parallel hypothesis by Porter that says that basically they will be the same. Okay, after a transition is done, we would not change the characteristic of the basic characteristic of the economy. So this is a conservative assumptions. Other can be done, and it's what actually I did in the scenario. So let me just also mention what this last number means. So the E0 and bar E1. So E0, this represents basically the national determined contributions that each country stated to respect in the cycle between 2021 and 2025. So basically, you know that in principle the Paris Agreement works by 5-year cycles. So it was the cycle that is finishing now. I did the analysis in 2023, so I was basically putting myself there in this cycle. Starting from 2026, this would be the carbon budget remaining for each country, applying a per capita distribution of basically the available carbon budget of a 2 degrees scenario with 67% probability. Okay, so let me go to the first result. So here in the picture, especially this, this top left picture represents the debt limit. Okay, so what would be sustainable? And this is for France. Okay, so the three scenarios represent different assumptions on the long-term growth rate. Okay. So the blue one represents the central scenarios of a parallel hypothesis. The green one is based on OECD results and this would be an optimistic scenarios, and the red one is a pessimistic scenario. Okay. So in general, what we can see that the fiscal limit is higher along a complete transition scenario than the debt to GDP that would be this dashed red line. Okay. So this is in our central scenario, okay, with the, I'm meaning this blue line, with interest rate, 5-year interest rate, real interest rate of 2.5% more or less, the real interest rate. This result applies for every country, okay? Only Italy and Lithuania are very, very close of their debt to GDP ratio. So the fiscal limit is almost equal to the debt to GDP ratio. What does it mean? That when we do some worse assumption in terms of the abatement cost, we can go easily lower with respect to the debt limit. So this is for Italy. You see the blue and red line are very close to the debt to GDP dashed red line. You see, for France, when we increase the short-term abatement cost, this beta I show you in the formulas, you can see that the debt limit can become lower than the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so main message is that transition costs have to be well managed. They can be well managed, but it's very important to do so in order to avoid fiscal sustainability issues in the short term. So this is for Italy, so very similar results, even worse. This is an exercise that I did by changing the maximization of settings, that instead of maximizing debt sustainability the initial fiscal limit, so the initial fiscal space, what I did is I maximized basically a stylized version of welfare, so the present value of future GDP, and the main implication is that that would be the blue line. Basically, what would we do? We would do a faster transition. You see, these are the carbon emissions. So you can see that the decrease in annual carbon emission is faster than what you would do if you want to maximize their sustainability. So welfare and their sustainability can imply different emissions reduction optimization for governments. What if we introduce climate damages? So in the formula, you remember there were the ratio between tomorrow contribution of emissions and yesterday contribution of emissions. To that, when we include climate damages, you have to add a ratio of tomorrow damages with respect to yesterday damages. That would represent the consequences of increasing damages to the growth rate and therefore to the sustainability. So what is the main implication when now we introduce damages into the model? So the green line represents basically a complete transition scenario. So every country in the world do the transition, and so basically follows the transition path of the country under consideration. For example, here the left France and the right Italy. So what happens that, as for the previous scenario, fiscal limits are decreased at the beginning. You see the green point is lower, at the initial part, and then is gonna to stabilize in the long term. So if we are able to keep temperature under control, damages are still there, but they become constant in the long term. So the growth rate is not affected anymore, and therefore the fiscal limit. What if we are not able to keep temperature under control? We follow a business as usual scenario. So that would be the black line. So basically, we continue to increase emissions at the current rate. What happens that for all countries, fiscal limits are going to decrease in the long term. So in the short term, they're not affected, but in the long term, of course, they plunge. The orange line, what does it represent? That would be that represent the case where France is doing the transition, but it's the only country that does so. The rest of the world continue to increase emissions at their current rate. So you can see that basically it's more adverse in the short term. Of course, France is doing the transition. In the long term, basically it's indifferent because France is a small portion of emissions in the world. For the US, is the unique country in my analysis which is a bit different. The orange line is going to cross at some point the black line, but the difference is quite small. So basically, what is the message here? The message is that the unique solution that we have in order to keep public debt sustainability is to be able to coordinate the transition at the global level and put ourselves on the green path. Not being able to do so will imply to put ourselves on or the orange or the black lines according to the different countries. Okay, so that's it for my presentation, and I look forward to hear the others.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for excellent presentation. I note at least two important points from your presentation. First, climate mitigation reduces fiscal space in the short term, especially for the highly indebted countries, but the cost of inaction leads to even greater long-term fiscal risk. Second, globally coordinated climate action is essential, not only for the environment, but also to safeguard long-term debt sustainability across countries. Now let me invite Oscar to present his work on how climate vulnerability and readiness influence sovereign spreads. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. So the paper I will present today is trying to make a connection between sovereign risk and physical risk, and highlight on the fact of preparation. And I want to convince you that preparation for physical risk have very important implications in terms of sovereign risk. So this is a published paper in Development Economics with my co-authors, José Eduardo Gómez and Cunha and Jorge Mario Uribe in University of Barcelona. And I would like to start with this stylized facts. So that episodes of natural disasters, the number of natural disasters. Here we compare emerging versus advanced economies. So the first thing that we see here is the number of disasters almost doubled in 20 years. So we have now more frequent episodes of disasters. And if you compare emergence with respect to advanced, similar type of disaster happens. So that is flood and storm. And why that is so important? Because the response in terms of the policy making matters to adaptate with respect to this type of shocks. So here is related with the response. So emerging economies face more challenges to reduce the exposure to natural disasters. So here is the Endgame index adjusted, the IMF version. So we compare again two groups, emerging versus advanced economies. What we see so far is there is a lot of less exposure in advanced economies with respect to what we have in emerging economies. So that has very important implications in terms of fiscal sustainability, and this is important because the scarce fiscal space. So right now we have a huge amount of debt in advanced and emerging economies. And it is happening that have positive correlations in terms of the negative impact in primary balance and in the interest payments that affect the accumulation of public debt. So what we do in this paper, so we explore the information on sovereign yields for all the countries in the world. So we want to understand the sensitivity of the natural disaster, but more important of the preparation, and see if there is asymmetries along the whole distribution. And what we want to analyze here is how this is affected the short-term and the long-term maturities. And we want to show that natural disasters, that is in the empirical papers, is almost missing the impacts. There are very few papers, and there is no clear evidence that have important effects on the sovereign risk. But we found that is significant, and it's more significant if we control for the factor of preparation. So preliminary findings that we have, climate change vulnerability increase in more short-term maturities, and it's more pronounced in the distribution that have more high risk profile, increase the borrowing cost. And of course, when we consider both together, natural disaster with preparation increase the fit of our results. So the first part is how we deal with the yield curves and all the yield, and because this is an unbalanced panel, so we need to care about this. And we use the following strategy. So in the first part, we use random forest to create imputation in the whole database of the yields, and also with a large database that we have for macro and institutional and debt-related variables. And then we explore the distribution, sorry. We explore the impact on the whole distribution of the yields, take into account typical variables related with institutional factors and macro debt also, but important preparation and vulnerability that we take from the end game, and natural disaster, of course. So here, so what we care a lot is how we deal with this data of yields. So we try to maintain the correlation that have the database previously, the imputation procedure, and after with the yields that we observe in US. And here are the main results. So we spread the result in two parts, the distribution of the highest spreads and the lowest spreads. And in colors, we have the yields in different years, and we have the variables that are significant. So I would like to highlight these two parts. First, vulnerability, increase the borrowing cost and increasing more in the short term. And readiness, reduce it. But the impacts is more pronounced in the part of the distribution with higher spread. When we include the natural disaster, that is not trivial, so we found the same results. In fact, the impacts on the distribution maintained, but the impacts of the natural disaster per se is quite low. So what I want to highlight here is preparation matters a lot to analyze the cross-sectional difference between countries in terms of what is the impacts of the physical risk. Yeah. So here, there is some cases in which are important natural disasters, but still is low. And here, I want to conclude. So what we found in this paper is very important heterogeneity in terms of the whole distribution of the impact on the physical risks on the distribution of the yields for emerging and advanced economies. And we found asymmetry impacts in terms of the preparation. So countries that have more resources and institutions related to preparation can exert less borrowing cost. And of course, the result depends also on the part of the distribution that the country has. If are in the low part of the distribution, the low borrowing cost, or if it is in the high borrowing cost. So I would like to highlight some policy implications coming from this. So how the governments deal with this, and is connected with the previous presentation related with the fiscal space. And you see in several countries when happen the shocks, is very often that have elevated amounts of debt. So part of this, that creates an amplification. So preparation is related also with the investment need that have the countries to mitigate the impacts. But most of the cases, all the mechanisms that are available in the market are more related with transfer risk, contingent lines, and risk sliding, but less understanding there is in terms of understand what is happening above the line. So how we create the fiscal space to finance public investment related with resilience. And this is not the same public investment that is typical we have in fiscal policy, because this public investment is more costly and also is more prone to the political cycle. So thinking about it, mechanisms to find this space and how the public investment can mitigate the impacts is a way to thinking about it, how preparation reduce the borrowing cost. So with this, I would like to say thank you and open to questions.
Thank you, Oscar, for a very comprehensive presentation. One note that I make from your presentation, a market has priced in the climate vulnerability, but unevenly. So countries with higher vulnerability will have higher cost of borrowing. Lastly, please, Kirill, to come to the stage to share with us his recent work on assessing how natural hazard events impact debt sustainability. Please.
So good afternoon, dear colleagues and participants at this great event. First of all, I would like to say thank you to everyone who took part in the organization of this great event. Thank you. So let me represent the results of research on the topic called assessment of the potential impact of natural hazard events on the debt sustainability of Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The authors of this working paper are chief economist and the expert of the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development. The purpose of this event is to assess the potential impact of natural hazard events on the sustainability of Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Why exactly these countries? We have chosen these countries because they are among the most disaster-prone countries who get the financing from the FSD. And to get this purpose, we set a range of tasks and objectives. The first task is to develop country profiles, which helps us to describe key natural hazard events in the country and other aspects of a country. The second task is to evaluate potential adverse effects of natural hazard events on key macroeconomic and data indicators. And third task is to develop recommendation for improving tools used to conduct stress testing as part of sovereign debt sustainability analysis. Let's move to this first task called country profiles. On these slides, you can see a country profile which we suggest. It consists out of different blocks which describe geography, climate, demography, economy, and natural hazard events. And all these aspects, all these blocks of country profiles, you will find in our working paper, which was published on the FSD websites in English and Russian languages. But let's consider shortly natural hazard events block in the country profiles of these three countries. Let's begin with Armenia. On the right-hand side graph, you can see a rate of occurrence of natural hazard events. You will see that storm, flood, and earthquake are among the most frequent events in this country. But when we will consider maximum damage from natural disasters, the maximum event was earthquake in 1988, so-called Spitak earthquake, and the drought in 2000. That's why we decided that earthquakes and drought are the main natural hazard events that may strongly impact economic stability in Armenia. What about Kyrgyzstan? We decided that we should consider the statistics that earthquakes and floods are the main natural hazard events that may strongly impact economic stability. And the same situation you can see in the Tajikistan. Let's move to the second task of our working paper and research is the assessment of the potential damage from natural hazard events. Let's consider earthquakes. On this slide, you can see three graphs. These graphs were made using the information from the global earthquake models. On the first graph on the left, you will see the most vulnerable areas of Armenia. On the second graph in the middle, you will see asset values among different regions in Armenia. And on the right-hand figure, you can see potential direct earthquake-related damage in billions of dollars dependent on the return period. So, as you can see, potential direct losses in Armenia due to earthquakes every 100 years can be amount about 12% of the GDP level in 2022. What about Kyrgyzstan? Potential direct losses in Kyrgyzstan can be amount about 24% of the 22 GDP level. And about Tajikistan, the potential direct losses can be amount about 27% of the 22 GDP level. So what about floods? You can see on this graph information which we got from JBA Risk Management. And you will see that every 200 years, the potential losses in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan can amount to about 5 till 6% of the GDP level in 2022. And it's also very important to mention that potential losses from floods do not practically increase with increase in return period over 2 years or more. This is because floods have a limited impact area, unlike earthquakes, which can much larger area. So, what about drought? In case of Armenia, we wanted to find out which areas in Armenia are the most vulnerable to drought. And thanks to World Bank Group Climate Change Knowledge Portal, we found out that Ararat, Armavir, and Argatsotn are the most drought-prone regions in Armenia. And when we will consider horticultural and agricultural output by regions in Armenia in 2022, in the event of total loss of crops in the most vulnerable regions, economic losses may amount to about 4 or 5% of a GDP level. And now let's move to the third task, modeling a shock scenario of natural hazard events within the DSM framework. According to the IMF approach, the baseline scenario is constructed first in the DSM framework, then followed by a number of stress scenarios, including the realization of natural disaster in which country's GDP is reduced by 10%. However, we believe that this approach is somewhat simplified. Therefore, our task was to modify it by taking into account the impact of natural hazard event, not only on the GDP, but also on other key macroeconomic indicators and gross financial needs. And on this slide, you can see the developed approach to modeling shock scenario, which we suggest. And this approach consists out of different steps. On the first step, you have to choose the disaster type. It can be drought, earthquake, or floods. On the second step, you have to choose supply. You have to assess supply shock. And you can use also different type of methods, depending on the disaster type which you have chosen. And afterwards, on the third step, we recommend to estimate the impact of supply shock on other macroeconomic indicators using QPM models. And afterwards, all these results you can overlay in stress testing using the same framework which was created by the IMF. As an example, let's look how the supply shock is assessed in the case of earthquake or the flood. In first phase, you have to estimate capital loss, potential capital loss. You can use different types of methods. First one is statistical. For example, you can use the table which is shown to you on the left-hand side. This table shows us potential asset losses subject to earthquake intensity in different regions of Tajikistan, or in the case of floods, you can use average annual flood-related losses among different regions in the Tajikistan. But interesting aspect here is you can use also stochastic or so-called probabilistic modeling. Here you can see all these graphs we have discussed before. You can use all this information and you can choose whatever you want. For example, potential losses which can happen in every 50 years or 10 or 100 years or 500 years. And in the second phase of the assessment supply shock, we can use how this capital loss can impact on the potential GDP level. In this case, we use the Cobb-Douglas production function. And as you can see on this slide, we find out that reduction of capital by 1% in these countries can reduce potential GDP level by 0.35 or 0.4%. And let's consider a case that there's a 10% capital reduction shock triggered by an earthquake or on the economy of Armenia first. Which result we got from using QPM models? First of all, you will see that potential GDP will decrease by 3.5%, but actual GDP will drop only by 2% around, and creating positive output gap. This is mainly because of stimulating fiscal policy which will be conducted by the government. On the second, as a result, you will see that inflation will rise slightly, and no significant response will be needed from monetary policy. And Armenian national currency will weaken slowly, not that much. What about Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan? Potential GDP will decrease by 4%, creating positive output gap in amount of 1.4%. Inflation will rise by, annualized inflation will rise by 1.2%. In this case, slightly tightening of monetary policy will be required, and Nigerian currency will weaken against the US dollars by only 0.25%. What about drought in Armenia? In this case, it's very complicated. It was very complicated to estimate the impacts on the main macroeconomic indicators, and they applied different types of shocks on the QPM models. First one is on the output, and the second one is on the inflation. We decided that the drought in the most vulnerable regions will cause 4% loss, 4% GDP drop in the country. And we use an expert judgment to apply shock on inflation equation, and considering an inflation basket in Armenia, we find out that in this case, inflation will rise additionally by 3% over the next 2 quarters. And more detailed information about this estimate you will find in our working paper. And in this case, additional demand for the imported products from abroad, which will be needed because of the lack of products in Armenia, will lead to national currency depreciation about 0.7, 0.8%. And in this case, an increase in the key rate will be required. And I also to mention that these results are quite similar, which the colleague from the Dutch National Bank have shown us, that the drought will lead to 4-5% of GDP, and inflation will increase around 3-4% in the next. So it's very similar results here. Yeah. To sum it up, this slide and the next slide present the necessary adjustment to the baseline scenario for stress testing under the previously discussed scenarios in the DSM framework. Now let's turn to the stress testing results. You can see here on the slides which scenarios were used. So for Armenia, we considered the scenario of drought, which can cause a 4% decrease in the GDP. For all countries under review, the scenario of 10% capital loss due to an earthquake or flood was considered. But at the same time, different options for public financing of the restoration of the lost capital were taken into account. In all scenarios, the government is assumed to fully compensate for the loss of commercial and industrial buildings. This is driven by the need to restore economic capacity as quickly as possible. For the housing stock, different approaches were applied. As you can see, here, it doesn't work. 0, 50, and 100%. It means that 0 government participation in the housing restoration, 15 government participation, 15%, and full compensation of loss of the housing. And following results were obtained. In the case of Armenia, you will see that solvency risk will be really very high in the last scenario. Liquidity risk will be also very high in the scenarios of 10% capital loss, but not in the drought. What about Kyrgyzstan? Kyrgyzstan will consider drastically solvency risk in the second and third scenario, and it will consider huge liquidity risk in all these scenarios. What about Tajikistan? We will consider solvency and liquidity risk rise in the second and the third scenario. And to wrap it up, let's remember key findings. Let's consider key findings. First one is country profiles. Armenia is the most vulnerable to earthquakes and droughts. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to earthquakes and floods. What about potential economic losses? Earthquake can lead to losses in amount of from $2.4 billion or $2.8 billion between all the countries we considered. Flood can cause to losses in the amount of $0.7 billion in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And drought in Armenia may result in losses of 4-5% of GDP. And about stress testing results. A realization of major natural hazard event will create a significant financial gap, making recovery impossible without a critical increase in debt or massive external grant support. Limited resources will force governments to choose between rebuilding critical infrastructure and supporting socially important facilities like housing, hospitals, and schools. That's it from my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kirill. You showed clearly how the natural disasters can erode the debt sustainability in the some in Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, as well as Tajikistan. Let me move to the next part of this session. I'll give the floor to Iader and Sebastian. Iader will facilitate the fireside chat with Sebastian. You have 20 minutes. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, dear Chair. Thank you, speakers, for your wonderful presentations. And thank you, Sebastian, for coming here. So we just heard 3 compelling presentations that highlight how climate change is reshaping sovereign credit risk and public finance. So Sebastian has a unique perspective on how climate-related factors are integrated into the rigorous analysis that informs global investment decisions. So the objective of this fireside chat is to bridge the gap between the academic research we have explored and the practical application of risk assessment in the market. So we want to understand how a major rating agency views these risks, what data and methodologies are being used, and what actions by policymakers are most impactful from a credit perspective. So Sebastian, thank you for being with us. We look forward to hearing your insights. So to start, from the perspective of a credit rating agency, how are climate change risks broadly categorized and factored into assessment of a country's sovereign credit worthiness? Do you distinguish significantly between physical risks and transitional risks with the shift to a low-carbon economy?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you, FLAR, ESM, and AMBRO for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in Medellín. You know, I'm from Argentina, so Argentinians, beyond the fact that we know how to live with inflation, we are really passionate about football, right? And one of the greatest football players came from Medellín. Actually, one of my top favorites football players is from Medellín. Yeah, Juan Fernando Quintero, for the ones that know that. So thank you guys for the question. So, yeah, I mean, climate change is very important for us, for the rating perspective, of course. And there's, of course, compelling evidence that, as we discussed here today, that these events are happening not only more frequently, but also with more devastating events. But these events are not new, right? So when we assess credit worthiness in sovereigns, we've been taking into consideration these factors for a long time. And actually, I could mention several stories in Latin America, which is my focus of research, where these events have led to defaults or have triggered major changes in credit quality, right? I mean, all across. So we have in our methodology, there is a public methodology, it's a long document, has several instances where we measure this, right? In terms of the concentration of the economy, how much of the external resources generated exports or are dependent on single products or single agricultural productions and things like that, right? So there's a lot of weight given already in the methodology to the effect that climate change or physical risk might have. Of course, because these events are becoming more important, more frequent, and with more devastating effects, we are broadening the analysis on this. And S&P Global Ratings, where I work, is part of a conglomerate, and that conglomerate has many other companies, and they have acquired some other companies today recently. One of them is Trucos, another is called Shades of Green. And what they do is basically producing a lot of data on climate events, historical data, and they also produce forecasts based on different scenarios they play around in terms of global warming, things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, it was important. It is very important. It would be definitely would be more important, and we are working to redefine some of these major events in terms of how they could play around the creditworthiness of the countries.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Let me move to another topic. So the transition to mitigate climate change involve significant policy shifts and investment, potentially impacting GDP growth and fiscal space. So how do you evaluate the potential economic and fiscal consequence of a country's climate transition policies? Are the costs associated with mitigating emissions and greening the economy seen more as fiscal burden or a potential driver of future growth and stability?
Okay, so I think one important caveat here is that what the rating means, right? We are talking about the capacity and willingness to comply with financial obligations, right? So one of the concepts we highlight when we talk about this type of events, climate, global warming, climate change in particular, is materiality. What's the materiality of the effect we are talking about, right? Because imagine that many of these factors will definitely affect sovereigns over the medium term. Some others will have impact on the short term. So materiality is very important for us because, I mean, when you talk about Latin America, for example, Latin America's average sovereign rating is BB, which is 2 notches below the investment grade level, right? So we need these BB entities. There are a lot of factors that will affect their creditworthiness very materially, and climate change maybe is not one of them, right? So, I mean, in terms of how they should rank their priorities in terms of what problems they need to solve in terms of financial stability, for example, right? Dependence on single products, on commodities, and therefore, right? But beyond that, of course, I mean, this climate change will affect them all at different instances. There are some countries that their GDP performance is extremely volatile because of their dependence on one single agricultural production, such as Paraguay, for example. So whatever they do will be very important for us, and we pay a lot of attention. And I mean, when we talk about readiness, right, adaptability, readiness, there's a lot of effort on that. A lot of attention has been paid already in some of the work we do within the sovereign rating framework, which is what we call institutional strengthening or institutional stability, which measures kind of the ability to react to problems in general, more focus on the macro, but also focus on climate change and these challenges, right? So we put a lot of emphasis on that. And that, I think, the evidence shows that that's more important than the debt level, actually. And this is an important thing to measure, to take into consideration when you're talking about sovereign ratings. The correlation between sovereign ratings and the debt level is very poor. Of course, it's stronger when you look to emerging market only, but it's not really the major factor explaining the ratings. So whatever is done on adaptability, readiness to financial risk, to macro risk, to climate change risks, will be taken into consideration. Is very important for us.
Okay, it's a wide range of priorities. So maintaining fiscal space is not as beneficial for financing the green transition and supporting sustainable debt. So similarly, post-disaster recovery requires significant resources. How does a country existing fiscal health and its capacity to mobilize financing for climate-related investment or disaster recovery influence its sovereign rating? It is very related to the last one.
Yeah. Well, I think there are the traditional things that could be done, the traditional tools that could be done, could help. And just because they are traditional doesn't mean they are not valid. They're still extremely valid, such as building countercyclical funds, having relatively a good debt structure in terms of tax rates, terms, currencies, maintaining low levels when you can, low debt levels when you can. So those things are pretty important and will have a weight on the rating. And more recently, we have seen many efforts on new tools that could help. We have been talking and we've seen the issuance of sustainability bonds, which is increasing extensively in Latin America and the rest of the world. And sovereigns have a major role to play on that regards because they open the market for the other entities in the country. So it's not only that they could help themselves through the issuances of those bonds, but also about half of what's been issued in Latin America over the last 5 years of sustainability bonds have been issued by sovereigns. So this is very important. And finally, what we've seen on new tools is, it's been discussed here too, the debt for nature swaps, right? Debt for nature swaps have been very important for several countries, Barbados, Belize, Ecuador, El Salvador. And this is an interesting mechanism where, but it requires the intervention of a third party, right? And it takes advantage of the fact that some bonds are trading very poorly in capital markets with a large discount, and this large discount could operate as an incentive for third party to participate, multilaterals or government agencies or conservancy agencies. And so there are all these windows of opportunity to contribute to climate and sustainability.
Okay, so let me move now to make a comparison for your point of view with some conclusion from the papers of our speakers. Particularly, one study highlights the impact of climate change preparedness and vulnerability on sovereign risk metrics, like credit spreads, can be significantly asymmetric, affecting high-risk countries or those with short-term debt differently than lower-risk countries. So do rating agencies' methodologies account for these potentially non-linear or asymmetric effects when evaluating sovereign risks across different countries and debt profiles?
The answer is yes. I guess what is the question will be related to this is what's the cause and what's the consequence, right? Because high-risk sovereigns, by definitions, will be vulnerable to external risk, whatever shape the external risk takes, financial, again, climate, geopolitical, or whatever. So, I mean, when we define the difference between sovereigns that are, or ratings in general, that are investment grade, that is, for us, it's BBB minus or above, and what the market calls speculative grade. The difference is really that. The major difference is whether you are more vulnerable or not to external shocks. And definitely, under the non-developed countries, emerging markets, we have less diverse financing sources. We have weaker debt structures, more dependent on foreign currency than local, floating rates than fixed, shorter terms in general. And this whole profile will make them more vulnerable, and would make them vulnerable to geopolitics in the world, to high interest rates in the US, and climate change as well, right? And so I think this raises the question of they'll be more vulnerable, and they have less resources and less capabilities to defend themselves. So to what extent there's an incentive for probably multilateral institutions or other players to have a bigger role in terms of supporting them in reaching those goals.
Great. So another study also suggests that a country's underlying vulnerability to climate change might be more influential in determining sovereign spreads than the actual occurrence of natural disaster. Does this finding resonate with your experience in assessing climate-related sovereign risks? And how do you balance the assessment of a structural vulnerability against the impact of a specific disaster events?
I think it depends on the sovereign, in the sense that it depends on their readiness, their ability to introduce public policy, macro policies in particular. And of course, I mean, more developed countries have better institutions, that they have more capabilities to deal with these events in general. But I mean, we have seen good cases and pretty good examples of sovereigns in Latin America that have been very proactive and have established resources of contingency lines, allowing them to withstand the things, right? Of course, I mean, I think the sovereign, of course, is more diverse than other entities. If you look at local governments, for example, then you see less resources and less capabilities to deal with these events. We have several examples of these, as the wildfires in California that were referenced here, or some water scarcity problems in northern Mexico, or some droughts in South America. But again, I mean, I think we could see some mechanism already built, such as this counter-cyclical funds, and things like that really help to go through these major events.
So the concept of a country readiness or preparedness for climate change is identified as a factor that can mitigate the impact of vulnerability on sovereign risks. So how important are investment in climate change adaptation and resilient building in your sovereign rating assessment? What specific types of preparedness measures are viewed most favorably from a credit perspective, and is readiness alone sufficient to offset vulnerability, particularly for more exposed nations?
Yeah, I mentioned this before, and we were surprised how many institutions are looking. I mean, there are many, well, I don't know if many, but some institutions that are looking at how we look at the institutional framework within our sovereign analysis, right? And again, this is tricky, right? Because, I mean, institutional strength is an important factor to determine sovereign ratings, but with a caveat that with respect to paying of debt, right? So we have, in general, I think it works well for other things, but not always, right? And we have cases where, this institutional strength within the rating framework has to do with the commitment the government has to pay foreign obligations. And for example, we have the case of where there are some sovereigns where there's high levels of corruption, fewer levels of transparency, no free press. However, I mean, the balance sheet is so good, and they pay a lot of attention to the compliance with paying foreign obligations or financial obligations in general, that will enhance our institutional analysis on these credits, right? So we need to be careful with that, because the rating has a mandate, right? And the rating, it's okay if we use that for something else or not. But I mean, because we need to define that for the rating, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how effective public policy is running each sovereign, how much transparency helps or not helps in that regard. Is there a free press? If there's what policies are done through consensus and what policies are not done through consensus. So I think having a better understanding of that institutional framework helps us on the sovereign ratings, but also will help in terms of trying to assess how much the sovereigns could adapt quickly themselves to the new challenges that climate change brings.
Thanks, Sebastian. I think so. I have time for a last question. So the importance of global coordination and climate action to ensure public debt sustainability is also highlighted. Does the level of international support a country receives, including climate finance and technical assistance from multilateral organizations, factor in your assessment of its capacity to manage climate risks and maintain debt sustainability?
Yeah, it's very important. It's very important, not only in terms of affecting the debt structure and the funding sources. We have special part of the analysis to devote a lot of time to understand to what extent there's access to concessional lending, to contingency line, how frequent they are, and those things are very important. And I think for most of this, I mean, the challenges for those countries in Latin America are major in all respects. I mean, climate change is definitely one of them, but I mean, we're talking about sovereigns with levels of poverty of 30 to 50%, right? So it's, in a way, an infant mortality, you call it, right? You have all the social indicators, and in many countries are dramatic, right? So it's sometimes it's a lot to ask for these countries at the same time to focus on issues that will be very important, and we have devastating events, but some of them will happen over the medium and long term, right? So assistance, not only funds, but also technical assistance is critical for many of these sovereigns.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian, for these valuable insights. It's clear that while research helps us model climate risks, the market reaction through rating and investor behavior plays a decisive role in shaping countries' fiscal realities. So, dear Chair, I return to you.
Thank you, Yader and Sebastian, for your thought-provoking discussion. Let's now open to the floor for questions. Afterwards, I will invite the panelists to respond to the question from the audience as well as from the comment from Yader and also Sebastian. Any question? Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and very useful topics. But however, I have questions for Katerina and Oscar. I will begin, Katerina. So you introduce for GDP growth function, and you are using exponential type function, yes, exp and power. Can we, for example, change this function for, let's say, because exponential function for growth rate GDP is not so realistic. It could be not so realistic. Maybe we change. Could we change, for example, exponential type function? Let's say for linear function, just additive type function. This is the first question. Please tell us what is your reason to choose exponential type function? This is I'm talking about equation number. I will mention 5 in your paper. And second question, your second most important suggestion, it's relating with the budget constraint, carbon budget constraint, and you are using just simple sum. In the left-hand side, just why, for example, you are not adding some coefficient between 0 and 1, which will be, for example, decreasing function. If we go to future, then this will decrease, and so on, converging in some numbers, for example. This is my question. And for Oscar, yes, agree with you that random forest and other machine learning algorithms is quite interesting and quite popular in our days. And you are using random forest for filling missing data in your data set and so on. However, there is no analytically provement that random forest is better than forecasting, bugging, or let's say boosting. Why we don't use, for example, as an alternative bugging and other way is random forest is a particular case of bugging. Bugging is more general case. So this is the first question. This can be considered like a comment also. And next question, in your presentation, in your paper, really very interesting. You presented algorithm how we can convert asymmetric data into symmetric data using quite interesting algorithm like Laplace asymmetric Laplace distribution. But you nothing to tell about this. And also in your paper, you are talking about factor augmented part. And you why, for example, you are using PCA, quite popular method in machine learning and so on. But this is, for example, it's interesting. You are using just rotated PCA or just PCA, because there are rotated principal components, which is because if we use just a principal component, in this principal without rotation, it could be a lots of noise. a lots of not important and noises, which could be not good. And why, for example, not you are using rotated instead? And from the other side, it will be if we were using rotated principal component would be more interpretable. Because in your paper you write in common factor component one component. What is mean component one? No, nobody understands this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yeah, Carlos.
Working already. Thank you. Two questions. I'll promise to be short. So one is to Sebastian. In terms of like on the inclusion of climate risks in the ratings, do you do it on a quantitatively in your models, or is it more with a qualitative overlay? Just to give you some context, at the IB we have also like a sovereign rating model for 160 countries which we lend. Myself and another colleague of mine, we are doing the work of quantifying it. We try to do it and it doesn't work. So if any insight of this, it would be helpful, because we found that for physical risk, and again goes to what Oscar was mentioning as well, lower rated countries, and what you were mentioning as well, like lower rated countries have higher physical risk, so there is a big correlation with other indicators like GDP per capita. But then for transition risk, we get the opposite, right? And higher rated countries have higher transition risk, so it actually would work on the other way around. So any insight on this will be helpful. And then to Oscar, when you mentioned that there is so the correlation or the contribution to higher spreads is higher on the short part of the curve. This probably is because of higher credit risk eventually, but or sensitivity to that. Is that the case to higher and lower income countries? It's the same across the income scale of countries? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that. Thank you.
I'll take another one more question from the floor. Okay, then please Katarina first, and then Oscar and Kirill.
Does it work? Okay, so thank you for your question. So basically the decision of the functional for the growth rate as for having also a treatable probability of default as a log normal in my paper, and it's easy, like doable to do that computationally, to solve the model computationally. Other functions could be used. I haven't tried that, but of course it could be done. It would be way more complicated to do computationally, especially if you want to complicate the model, I think, and add, for example, long-term debts. If you go away from the log normal, it would be very complicated. So that's a way to basically quickly solve the model for many countries. Then on this point also, in principle, what matter in the sense is the risk part. So if you want E to the sigma part, then you could in some sense separate the historical average growth rate. I don't know, it would make much sense theoretically to do that. But yeah, you can actually treat that in other ways. If your issue is just E to the mu and not the risk part, you could treat it differently. Then it would be complicated to justify that in terms of distribution of the growth rate. So then also on the carbon budget constraint actually is how we do that, how I did it to treat it as a 0 to 1, because I just used this. It's computation is how I did it, and I represented in the slides as the sum of future emission from today to infinity has to be lower than the carbon budget, and actually in the model is treated at the sum of emissions over the carbon budget has to be lower than 1.
Thank you for your comment. So the 3 or 4 technical comments we can discuss in detail after, if you want. But I would like to say few points about the imputation method is cares about the maintain the correlation with the unbalanced database with respect to balance with respect to the U.S. yields. that's important, and maintain the sense. I agree that you can use every method that you want. We tried several methods, and the information criteria was the way that we choose why of this. Not always because you have a gradient boosting always will be perform better. So that's the point. And with the PCI, I agree with you. So that is, but the computational burdens is high because it's high dimensionality in the procedure. So it's not simpler as normally things that implementing this. So that's the point. And in the journal, you will find all the replication packages of all details of this. And with respect to your question, very important, the heterogeneity. And one factor that is crucial and is connected with Sebastian, when say the degree of the diversification in the economy matters a lot, complexity. So we took the complexity index of Hausman and Hidalgo, and is high robust to predict the cost of borrowing, and also in the whole distribution. So that's answered the point in the heterogeneity, not only in terms of income levels, but also in the structure of the economies. Yeah.
Any reaction from Sebastian? Please.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? I mean, I guess we are going through the same path that you guys are, because the data is not that great yet, right? And that's why I mentioned there's a segment of our company that's working a lot on that. So we do have a lot of metrics and quantitative data that is already embedded into our model or to our criteria. But we're trying to refine that. We'll be playing around with more data to see how it plays out, but the results are not robust. And we were even trying to develop kind of a ranking scheme for environmental issues, and see if we could, in addition to the rating, we could provide kind of a ranking. Let's say Uruguay is BBB rating, but then on environmental issue is ranked 3 out of 6. But that product, we've been working a lot on that, and that product has not really moved much yet. And I guess it will take time until the harmonization, standardization of the data provide more kind of a stronger, more robust results, I guess. And of course, there's all the qualitative part as well, right? On the readiness, and what we were discussing on the ability to run public finances efficiently, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. I think we have come to the end of the session. I know there are still a lot more to that we can explore more, but because we are running out of time. So to close this session, let me summarize few takeaways from our discussion today. First, climate change is now a major driver of sovereign risk. As Katarina showed, both mitigation costs and climate damage can significantly reduce fiscal space, even in advanced economies, highlighting the need for global coordination. Second, climate risks affect countries differently. Oscar's finding reveal that fiscally constrained countries face higher borrowing costs from climate vulnerability. And the readiness alone is not enough. A stronger support mechanism are needed. Third, Kirill country-level analysis shows how natural disasters can erode debt sustainability without financial buffers. Building resilience requires stronger fiscal framework, investment in climate-resilient infrastructure, and better access to contingency financing. Overall, climate risks are already reshaping debt trajectories, integrating them into fiscal planning and fostering international cooperation will be key to maintaining both climate ambition and debt sustainability. Once again, thank you for the great discussion and also insightful contribution from our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdurrahman, and to all our panelists and discussants for session 3. We will now have a short 15-minute coffee break before the final policy experts roundtable. See you all in 15 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. We now reach the closing session of the day, our policy experts roundtable, which will bring together global experts in climate finance and macroeconomic stability. The roundtable will be chaired by Nicola Giamarioli, Secretary General and Management Board Member of the European Stability Mechanism, ESM. Secretary General, please kindly take the floor to start this important session.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased of having joined this event. So it's the 9th edition. 10 years ago with Carlos and Yasuto Watanabe from AMRO, we had this silly idea of putting together regional financing arrangements. We went a long way. I think today has been quite an inspiring day with many presentations and colleagues. So this panel is the last panel, separates us for dinner, so bear with me. And we try to make it very engaging and interesting. I think this is the good conclusion after these thought-provoking presentations. I think we reach a common understanding that climate change, being it extreme events or transition to the low-carbon economy, has quite sizable macroeconomic fiscal impact. Also financial stability linkages are very important. However, when we discuss about policy, we cannot disregard the political environment we are living with. Do we have citizen understanding and supporting this? We have competing priorities, polarized priorities. So when we discuss policy or best policy making, I think we cannot avoid having this context with us. So I'm very happy also to have such distinguished panelists bringing in experience from academia, from international financial institutions, governments, and policy making. So let me start by introducing them one by one before giving them the floor. On my right, I have Jose Antonio Campo, professor at Columbia University, former finance minister in Colombia, also board member of the board of directors of the central bank. He has been researching extensively on many fields, macroeconomic development, international finance, developing economics, history of Latin American economy. So there's a lot he can bring to this panel. Also a good friend of FLAR and RFAs. I remember he joined our second research seminar in Cartagena back in 2018. Then Pekka Moren. Pekka has a long career in finance ministry in Finland, also European institutions. He was the one who led the project of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. He has had many roles in this grouping. Now I think you are global advisor of the co-chair. Also, you represented the Finnish Prime Minister in the International Climate Club of Heads of States and Governments. Also a good friend of one of the RFAs, at least, ESM. I've been interacting with Pekka for many, many years. He was there when we were created, and also through the European debt crisis, quite involved. To the right of Pekka, we have Kevin Curry, a long career at the World Bank, now lead economist. He specialized in climate economics, sustainable finance. He contributed to global policy dialogue and also to integration of climate risk into macro framework, also providing policy advice to government on crisis resilient developing strategy. Last but not least, Christine Richmond, already she gave the introductory speech this morning. She's Deputy Division Chief of the Climate Policy Division in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, also long career at the IMF with different roles, and research interests span from firm dynamic in low-income countries, measures of sovereign debt, and access to credit markets. If I said something wrong, tell me, because sometimes, I mean, last year, the same seminar, I was introducing a colleague, I got completely wrong, and she was blaming me, but then I showed her the LinkedIn account and what I was saying was right. So then she apologized, she went to change the references in the LinkedIn account. So we'll try to have several rounds depending on the time. And since we discuss policy options, I will start focusing on climate change and financial stability. So what, for example, central banks, supervisors, market participants can contribute to policy development in this field. I would like to start with Jose Antonio. He worked on procyclicality, so how international financial markets amplify vulnerabilities in emerging market economies in particular. But in this framework, maybe if you can share with us what international financial institutions, credit rating agencies, central banks can do to better account for climate exposure in their own frameworks, but also how they can develop systemic resilience. So I'm referring to risk pooling, catastrophe bond, or insurance schemes. And last but not least, if you can share with us what, in your view, could be the role of regional financing arrangements in this domain.
For Isham, how much time do we have?
Let's try to have 3 rounds, 5 minutes each, and then I give the floor back. Well, so if you take more now, you have less in the other rounds. It's also up to you.
Okay. Well, let me thank for the invitation to be in this meeting. I have learned quite a bit, by listening to the different panels. Has been quite interesting. Now, on this issue of procyclicality, which is, of course, a topic on which I have written extensively, I don't think it has related to the climate change. It's really related to the let's say to the monetary policy of the advanced countries, and particularly of the U.S. So when interest rates of the U.S. are high, we get less bond financing and very expensive one. And when the U.S. Interest rates are low, we get lots of financing and lower interest rates. So that's a procyclicality. I don't think it's associated to climate change. Now, in the case of climate change, I mean, also by listening to the different speakers, let me say that I think there are two issues. The issue of financing, which I would say for long-term financing, I would say the role should be primarily of the multilateral development banks. And let me say, of one institution that has not been mentioned at all in this meeting, but having worked for 10 years in the United Nations, I won't going to mention it, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the funds that it manages. And it has that's a very interesting discussion going forward, because in many cases, in developing countries, and particularly in low-income countries, financing has to be concessional, and that requires the support of the Climate Change Convention funds. Now, for the issues that relate to monetary policy, to the central banks, and to the regional financial institutions, and to the IMF, I think the issue of shocks is the main important issue, the most important issue, and particularly the effects of shocks, let's say on, I guess, on balance of payments or fiscal issues, and therefore how to manage that is the role. So I mean, one big discussion here is on the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Trust. I think it should be a World Bank trust, not the IMF trust. Anyway, so I'm going to give it to the World Bank. I don't think the IMF should be involved in managing, I think the IMF should be involved in managing the risk, the macroeconomic risk associated to climate change, as it also involved the fiscal risk, for example, on social issues, etc., but not necessarily to fund. Climate change. Anyway, I think that should be important. Now, The other big issue is risk management. And in that regard, based on what I have heard here, first of all, there is the proper assessment of risk. I think all the international institutions, the banks, the IMF actually, also, but also the Framework Convention, the UN Framework Convention, can actually provide a good, help to develop a good analysis of the risk associated to climate issues. Now, there is also the issue of regulation and supervision, which was discussed, partially in the second panel, which I think is an important one. There should be strict regulations and therefore supervision on the financial risk associated to climate financing. That's a point. I mean, a good question mark there is the Financial Stability Board. Should the Financial Stability Board issue global regulations in that regard? Certainly nationally they should be. In Colombia, for example, actually those regulations were promoted by the private sector and they are in place. But that's an interesting point that, because that's a financial risk that has to be included in financial regulation. Now, there's also the issue of risk sharing, which has been also discussed here, particularly the insurance mechanisms that should be developed. But in some cases, I think there has to be a public sector resources supporting some of these risks. Let me say in particular two issues, two cases. First of all, adaptation. Adaptation is something that really requires fiscal resources, not necessarily, certainly not credit, or in few cases credit, but basically fiscal resources. And one that has not been mentioned in the discussion, but which is the central issue in this country in terms of climate generation or contribution to climate change, which is deforestation, and how to break deforestation, promote policies of different character for the people who live in the borders of the forest, so that they don't deforest, and actually even subsidize reforestation, let's say, as one of the basic policies, let's say. I will stop in this round now.
Thank you very much also for broadening the debate also to other aspects. You mentioned the United Nations that was not in scope, also regulation and supervision, the FSB. I think all this is very relevant. I would like also taking advantage of one of your comments to give the floor to Kevin on the role of the World Bank, both ex post in financing recovery or disaster, but also ex ante, how you help to promote climate disaster risk management in the country of operation.
Thanks, Nicola. Is this? Yeah, good. All right, so a few points on this. So first, specifically on the disaster risk finance, when I talk to our colleagues in the bank on disaster risk finance about what it would take to scale it up and embed it more, the first thing they remind me is that you can't separate disaster risk finance from disaster risk management. And these are quite specialized functions, in the governments that we deal with and in the bank. Disaster risk management is very much about, there's a specific agency that's in the lead. When a disaster occurs, they're doing all the coordination, figuring out where aid needs to go, do the rapid assessment, and so on. And we had this very stylized division between the disaster risk management people and the finance people who would say, just tell me the trigger and I'll design the financial instrument that will pay off when the disaster occurs. Now, I think we knew all along that's not quite right, that, and this was mentioned earlier actually, that where the money that's raised by a disaster risk finance instrument is going to go really matters for this broader resilience, and whether you want to call it building back better or just if it's social protection, how beneficiary is identified, how quickly it's paid out, and so on. How well PFN systems are working in moving money where it needs to go, how well central bank payment systems are moving money where it needs to go. So we've always seen the need for that integration, but it's not so easy when you've got these very specialized functions and divisions both on the client side and, to be honest, on the bank side as well. But I think we're working on it. I think there is a broader shift to contingent finance that's happening anyway. Christine already mentioned there were some contingent instruments there even before there was a natural disaster window at the fund. We always had the catastrophe, the budget support instruments with the deferred drawdown option. The Colombia case was referred to this morning. So they were always there, but the World Bank has been rolling out what we call the crisis toolkit, which is meant to make these instruments bigger, easier to use. So more ways to use budget support with a deferred drawdown, keeping it live for longer. They used to be limited to 2 or 3 years. Now they can go to 5, and so on. So there's plenty being done to make these instruments more that countries would want to use. They're still a little bit specialized. I think it's very much Latin America and the Caribbean where there's heavy use of these instruments. But I think the idea is to take what's been learned from there and think how it could go more, more globally, at least among developing countries. A few points just on the scale up, and I want to bring this back to Christian's question about why the catastrophe bonds are not used more than they are. So one issue, in addition to what was mentioned, I think by Bernard in his response, is that there's a difference in perspective of what these things are meant to do. I think if you're on the climate side of the discussion, you want to see them pay off when some kind of abrupt event occurs. But if you're designing them, you want to be very strict about when they pay off. And this arose last year in the hurricane season last year in the Caribbean. There was a prominent case where a country had a catastrophe bond, was hit somewhat by a hurricane, but it did not pay off. And so there was a lot of to and fro about why this was. And one of my colleagues, there was a view coming from the climate side, well, there's too much fine print in these documents. And one of my colleagues was asked about this, and he said, there's no such thing as fine print in these documents. The entire document is fine print. The fine print is the print. That's the way it's designed. So I think we'll continue to have a little bit of a clash between, there's going to be an instrument with a 200-page prospectus that you have to read every word to understand when it pays off, versus will it really, how to scale it up and make it pay off when people see that it should. Just a few points in closing on what impedes layering of risk. One is definitely this, the instruments are not necessarily, they're very customized, and therefore maybe there's already some challenge in scaling them up. One issue we see a lot in low and lower middle income countries is you'd want reinsurance to play a big role, but you run into very basic constraints on expanded access to reinsurance for low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. There's often a very basic regulatory or FX obstacle to a domestic insurance company engaging with a reinsurer. I'll give you an extreme example. If we were talking to Malawi about, why aren't you using reinsurance more than you currently are for the risks that you're exposed, the domestic insurers would say, we can't get the FX to contract with an insurance company. There are no dollars for anybody. Dollars are rationed, and we're not going to get dollars to transact with an insurance company. And then final issue is just the parameter uncertainty in developing countries. I think we've had good discussions today, but there is a lot of data out there, a lot more you can do, but we still don't know a lot about how a climate hazard would actually show up as a risk to a bank, a risk to a portfolio. Even advanced middle-income countries, that data is often not there, and therefore designing these instruments that could respond to a risk that you're uncertain about is not so easy. I'll stop there. Nicola, thanks.
Thank you very much. And I would like now to move to the IMF side. I don't know how much, Christine, you want to react to the provocative statement of Jose Antonio. It's up to you. I'm not asking it, but feel free to react to that. You already explained this morning the role of the IMF in the Rapid Facility and RST. My question would be more on the integration of climate risk consideration in macrofinancial frameworks. You explained this morning how you do it in your own analysis, but now I'm more interested when you approach your member, how you advise central banks, fiscal authorities, supervisor regulation, how they should better integrate in their own analysis the climate risk considerations. So feel free to answer to any of these provocative questions.
Is this okay? So again, thank you very much for getting to participate in this event and this panel, and I feel like I want to respond to all of the things that have been said so far and not answer the question that you asked me. But okay, so the IMF's executive board made this decision for this instrument, and we enact that policy. Again, I think that we are taking a long-term view that climate change is macrocritical and it addresses prospective balance of payments issues over the long term. And that is the rationale for us to be involved. So I'm going to just say that about the RSF. Now, I'm going to pick up a point that Jose Antonio brought up just about deforestation. And I think that this is a really interesting topic because I go out and talk to a lot of countries, and I was just in Togo 2 days ago. Deforestation is a topic that's related to adaptation, but also to the mitigation side. Countries are looking at this as a way to raise money through carbon markets. So there's interest in this, you know, from every climate-related perspective. I think that our view is that a lot of the times we think of each of these adaptation issues separately. We don't bring them together, and I think that's something that the fund is trying to do a better job with, of talking with our, you know, not necessarily central banks, but like other stakeholders in countries. Like, how does deforestation fit together with agricultural policies, with land use policies, with urban planning? Because you can't think of each of these policies just in, you know, in isolation. They all depend different resources from each other, and there have to be trade-offs. And I think that that is something not just the IMF can do, but all of us in all of our institutions can work with our different constituents to think about these issues more holistically. Kevin, I like your discussion about the disaster risk financing. From our perspective, we find that the CAT DDO kind of instruments are only a small part of the financing that's available. And that's almost like the end of the road. And it's more about how do you use the available budget resources, the different pockets of money that you can get access to within your budget or going out to markets. And as of now, the countries that we're interacting with, it seems the DRF is only like a small part, like the insurance part. So how to scale that up, I think, is a big issue. So, okay, I'll be really quick on if I'm allowed. So I think, you know, what I showed and talked about earlier today is also what we do with countries. It depends on how advanced they are and how the sets of problems that they have. So, you know, the more sophisticated work is what we're going to talk about with our like more advanced economies. Some of the work is going to be more qualitative for lower income countries or those that just don't have the data. So we can think about, okay, you're in country X, you don't have the data, how can we apply country Y data? Is that good enough to help you make examples? But, you know, from the fiscal side, we're doing a lot, but our capital markets and monetary colleagues are also doing a lot. They're working on the FSAPs, and they do 3 to 4 of those per year across a variety of countries and look at, you know, the challenges there. I think, you know, a recurring theme is lack of data, lack of information, how to incorporate that information, and it shows that we all need to work better to figure out the best way forward.
Thanks a lot, Christine. And I will move now to Pekka. As I said, you work a lot and you initiated this coalition of finance ministers for climate, but maybe this would be tackled later. Now I want to pick up your brain on Finland, because Finland has been a pioneer in having climate-informed budgeting. So we are moving a little bit into fiscal policies, so how climate consideration have been introduced in Finland to cater for debt sustainability, for example, or how to make a public budget climate friendly, I would say.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Before I answer to your question, I just want to make a point about the importance of being here in Latin America today, because you raised the point about how the coalition was established, but the key partners in doing that came from Latin America. There were many countries who actually supported the work. We chaired that with Chile, who also chaired the COP meeting at the time, and many Latin American countries joined, and we really call them as founding members of the coalition. So thanks for that. When it comes to Finland, I mean, people often, like you did, refer to we as first movers. We introduced the carbon tax first in 1990. Then some other countries followed, and then there was a bit silence, and many others came a bit a decade later or so. Also on budget tagging, Finland was among the first movers, but that was and still is very experimental. And I have to say, when it comes to Finland on budget planning, we haven't made much progress in the past couple of years. And I can tell you why. The reason is that it's fairly easy to get going, start identifying budget items. You could put a couple of civil servants to do, experts to do that. But if you want to move forward, you need much more. You need to think about your budgetary process. You need much more political engagement, stronger mandate. You need technical capacity, IT systems. You need data. You need reporting frameworks. You need definitions. So a lot of groundwork that you need actually start requiring a lot of resources. That's what we also have identified in the Finance Ministers Coalition as a key challenge. And some countries are moving now, but in Finland we are a bit having a timeout here. And one reason also for that is not an issue that has not been mentioned here today so much, but the climate-related risks, as we have seen in the maps in Finland, they are very low. But the biodiversity loss-related risks are much higher. So we have also introduced in the meantime, 2 years ago, a new strategy in the Finance Ministry where we actually make an effort to combine the two, which is not easy. So that's maybe also a reason where progress has been a bit slower the past 2 years. But we are now working on the modeling. I can tell you a bit more about that in the coalition context. But the last point that I also want to make, because this is a regional event, and we will talk about that, but I want to mention it now in the context of Finland, because we are part of the European Union. And the European Union has a very strong economic policy coordination, and it's particularly and coordination of internal markets and climate policies. And the climate tax and carbon pricing, it's a good example with the ETS system, for example, that we have in the European Union. I don't think we would have that without European Union. The markets for trading emissions, that's one of the big achievements, I think, of the European Union. We have been discussing carbon pricing. I want to make this point now, because when today, in one of the presentations, an excellent presentations on the topic, one observation is that those countries who actually proceed and implement these, they are very advanced economies. That means that, and we have also learned that from the finance minister's work, that many countries would like to proceed with carbon pricing reforms, but they simply cannot do that because of political, technical challenges, and it takes a lot of effort and time, and they are normally also need to be packaged into broader policy reforms in that area. But I will maybe say a bit more about the coalition work in the next round. Thank you.
And just you give me the opportunity to start the next round, and I would like to go somewhat in reverse order and start from you, because you can enlarge your contribution from the Finnish experience to the coalition experience. Maybe you give us a little bit hint how this coalition has evolved, what are the challenges, if you're facing political, technical, institutional challenges. Also, maybe if you can refer, since we are in this regional context, I've read in the strategic planning that also the coalition is looking at regional dimensions, so what this is about. Thank you.
If you may, I would like to start because recently I had a meeting with the Prime Minister, and Prime Minister was the person who actually started the coalition. Actually, we made that proposal 7 years ago, ahead of the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, which he was actually chairing. So that's why it was a good opportunity for him. But he was asking, what has the coalition achieved? And I gave him our guidebook. This is a big document. I carry it with me whenever I go to give presentations because it just shows that there's a lot of work. But basically, what I said to him that we have been working 5 years, and this is basically what you can say somebody asked, that we have quite a full understanding now what needs to be done. And there is good news, that's the good news, and really the bad news is, or the challenge is that we also know that there is a lot of work, and we need to be realistic. We need to understand that this takes a lot of work. And there are governance issues, capability-related issues, expertise issues, and also these kind of international, how can we benefit from the international community? One quite trivial, this may sound surprising when I raise this point, but it keeps coming back, the mandate issue. Is there a mandate for finance ministers to actually work on these issues? Many react to that question that is, of course they have a mandate, they have the budget, they have the taxation. But the case is that we've been going around with this guidebook in the countries, presenting it to the ministries. When you ask the question from finance ministry officials, ministers, different persons, you always get different answers. So that means that the mandate is not there or it's not clear. Those countries that have the mandate, they actually have finance ministers sitting around the table, presenting the calculation, policy trade-offs, economic impact assessments. They are part of the NDCs. But I can tell you there are not many countries where that is the case. We're talking about maybe 5 countries out of 100. It's now almost 100 members that the coalition has. So that's an important point to make. So the coalition, I think if you think about its role, in order to make things happen, you need political ownership and you need to go quite deeply into the technical matters. We cannot make any political moves, serious reforms, unless there is a serious work calculations. Carbon pricing is a good example. It takes a lot of work to implement actually those, and you need to then follow up and monitor. You need connections with the research community, and you need to involve a lot of actors into that. So there's a lot of governance also involved. And by the way, this is also a general observation, and it has to do with today's discussion. I think it was in one of the presentations, the survey of the coalition, where more than 80% of the finance ministries don't have fiscal and resiliency risk in their fiscal planning. I think the number is actually much bigger because this was only a sample of like 50 countries out of 100 countries. Those who don't answer normally don't have it. Automatically, they don't have it. And so that's, but it's also in Finland we don't have it. And I think that's one reason why we started to work on this guidebook, because our management team of the civil servants, quite frankly, 4 years ago said that we have a lack of understanding, so we need to start working on these matters. And that's why I was really happy that today, when I was listening to presentations, I think it's been now through it's quite clear that a lot of work has been done in the past years on that, and there seems to be now quite a good amount of work and very good high quality work on that topic. So soon we should not longer say that we don't have the awareness now. There are other challenges then, but I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pekka, and also to outline the difficulties on, so sometimes theoretical models, what we discussed this morning, I mean, you run equations and everything is crystal clear, but when you come to policy and to policy implementation, I think it's not as easy. And I want to pick up also Kevin on that, especially in your developing countries work, how to make sure that, how to handle the trade-off between the short term and the long term. Because I think policymakers are obsessed about getting results sooner rather than later. They have limited fiscal space. They need to deliver on growth. On the other hand, when you tackle climate risks, it's more long term. And there is, for me, a tendency to kick the can down the road, to have the new generation paying for it, but how you in your work in the World Bank try to advise and try to make sure that we find the right balance between the short term and the long term.
Yeah, there's a few things I could mention here. There's definitely a fiscal part to it, and Christine already mentioned that in the sense of the space that can be in the budget to sort of make that trade-off less sharp. A couple of things I would mention. I mean, there's certainly a lot of effort that has gone into, let's say, climate budget tagging or green budgeting. I mean, one thing we've been finding consistently is there might be a case for flipping that and say, let's talk about brown budgeting rather than green budgeting. So, I mean, let's be really precise about the spending that's going on energy subsidies, for example, really setting back mitigation goals. But even if you wanted to make it about adaptation, there's probably quite a bit of spending on the budget that's related to maladaptation rather than adaptation. And, you know, we could have an intervention where we're helping a country design, say, a more climate resilient road, but the real issue is that road has been built in the wrong place. So that road is going to encourage people to build houses or to, you know, expand agriculture into a forested area or something like that. So there's a risk sometimes we're focusing on saying there's a very narrow intervention that sounds good, but it needs to be put into a broader picture of fiscal policy, you know, looking at fiscal policy together with markets that you think might not be working properly, distortions that might not be there. And then it becomes not so much a question of trade-offs, but just making sure that you're not worsening, when you put the policy together, you're not worsening distortions that are already there. And this comes up over and over again in our dialogue in developing countries. For example, agricultural subsidies. Are they keeping farmers located in places where they shouldn't be, or growing crops where they shouldn't be growing crops, or using nitrogen fertilizer that they shouldn't be using, or too much of it, or whatever it is. So we're trying to steer the discussion more to that. Another thing I would mention is, one thing that comes up again and again in this is the issue of intergovernmental fiscal relations. So meaning if you've got national, state, and local. Basic issue in adaptation is local. And often the best information for dealing with adaptation is at the local government or the state government level. In many developing countries, that's also the least resourced level of government. There's just not that much money moving down the intergovernmental transfer system, but they also have extremely underdeveloped tax bases. You look at cities in Africa that have huge adaptation challenges. They just don't have the tax base that we're used to, like property taxes, for example, or local income taxes to tackle that. So this, I think, is a major issue, and you can have the focus on long-term growth with certain types of investment, but you really need to tackle this issue of adequately resourced state and local governments. And then, the final thing I would say is just specifically on the issue of debt. There's an ongoing review by the Bank and the Fund of the low-income country debt sustainability framework, and there were several really interesting papers already on this. I think whatever happens there, it's not going to. There will still be a case for fiscal buffers, even if you come up with the rationale to borrow more to spend on debt. And you look at countries that have gotten into trouble from from climate shocks, it's often because the level of debt was already, they didn't have much room, and that made, that made things worse. So I think some of those very traditional type of issues, keep the fiscal buffers, adequately resourced local governments, and certainly looking at the budget, how it interacts with other distortions, they'll all matter. And then hopefully it's not just saying to a minister, do I put $1 in growth or $1 in resilience, but am I thinking about what this looks like from an overall climate and particularly a maladaptation perspective.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And I want to pick up one point that you mentioned with Christine, which is the joint work between the bank and the IMF on the debt sustainability analysis, and how you are working together to introduce climate consideration into this joint work. Also, maybe with a perspective, how we can learn in the regional financing arrangements on our cooperation with the multilateral development bank. So sometimes I see the relationship that you have, the two institutions across the road, we should also have in our region between us and the multilateral development bank, for example, ESM and the EIB, AMRO, Chiang Mai with the Asian Development Bank. So maybe there's something we can learn from your collaboration on our regions. This is for us to pick it up. It's not for you to teach us, but just I'm telling you the perspective that what we can learn out of your cooperation.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much. So first off, so I've been at the IMF a while. I've been around the institution quite a bit, and I have to say that on climate-related issues, I think the coordination and collaboration between our two institutions is amongst the best that compared to other issues that I've seen arise. So I think it can serve our institutions well for broader coordination and collaboration. Hope Kevin feels the same way. But we collaborate on so many issues, right? We write papers together, we interact at COP, we had joint pavilion the last couple of years, we coordinate and collaborate on G20, G7. Both institutions are the co-hosts of the Secretariat of the coalition, so we work very closely on those things. And we also develop tools together. One of them that we like to advertise a lot is what we call CPAT. It's the Climate Policy Assessment Tool that is a spreadsheet-based model of models that looks at all countries, or 200 plus countries, to estimate the effect of climate mitigation policies. And both institutions work on that, bringing their respective skill sets. I think, from our perspective, we're looking at the macro fiscal, and from the World Bank side, they're bringing their really sector-specific knowledge on like power sector and granular details. And I think this is a great example of how we can collaborate and be successful and show joint messages and results. So this is a really powerful tool. And this one in particular has been a collaboration going on for more than 7 years. So we have a long-term collaboration here. So regarding debt, what Kevin has mentioned, I think this is an ongoing review. We're making progress. I think it's supposed to go to or at least the IMF's board by the end of this calendar year. I think it's proving to be again. I think an underlying theme is that incorporating climate into frameworks is a much more difficult task than we might think at the beginning. And so this work is continuing to go. But there is going to be a climate-specific module that looks at both mitigation and adaptation issues. But it's not just the modeling of these adaptation and mitigation issues, it's also going to look at the financing specific instruments and how to think about treating those, because that's also come up today about how do we think about, CAT DDO or these insurance mechanisms, climate resilient debt clauses, debt for nature swaps. So we need to think about how to best incorporate that information. Now, if I can just, think off the top of my head about what could maybe regional financing arrangements learn from the collaboration that we have, our institutions. I think that a lot of it's based on personalities, as much as we sign these MOUs or anything. It's about the individuals that want to collaborate and they have this vision of doing good work. And right now in both institutions, it's there. And there's a series of collaborations, sharing of information, again, across this data sharing issue that keeps coming up. We have a lot of joint seminars to distill all the information that we're generating ourselves across. So we have a lot of opportunities to share our ongoing work, but then to ensure that the policy lines are aligned as well. So I think that's something, again, I apologize if this is already something that you do, but I think that in the climate sphere between our two institutions, this is something that we're actually doing a really good job on.
I cannot agree more. I'm aware that you have been signing MYUs for ages and reviewing in the boards. They never work, and suddenly given to maybe changed external condition, but also personalities, they start to work. I think in our world is the same. That's why we organize these events also, is to know each other, and collaboration is practicing collaboration, not just writing official documents. So I can now turn to Jose Antonio. Of course, you can react to any elements that were brought by colleagues, but on these specific issues, and I think Christina mentioned on how to introduce climate consideration into fiscal framework, into debt management framework. You have been working also on debt restructuring. Is this something relevant or not?
Let me perhaps start by a broader analysis of debt. I have been also deeply involved in another UN process, which is the Conference on Finances for Development that will take place in Spain, the middle. So one of the big issues is debt.
Yes.
Actually, we consider the over-indebtedness is the main problem that has to be discussed in that meeting. So that's anyway. So and around that there are three recommendations, which in a sense I'll connect them later with climate. The first one is that debt sustainability analysis of the World Bank and the IMF should take into account the possibilities of growth of countries, investment and growth, because if there is no investment and growth, debt is not going to be sustainable anyway. So growth is the best opportunity to actually pay debts. So one of the big recommendations, and that includes, by the way, the investment that may require for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so that's one basic point. The other 2 points is that we recommend a new debt restructuring mechanism, a short term, better than the common framework. They said the Brady plan for Latin America was much better than that common framework, and it has to be, allow a significant reduction in debts of the countries that are over-indebted. And the other is a long-term institutional mechanism. So an institution that will be where countries could go and renegotiate debts. That's a recommendation. We say that institution, we prefer that institution to be in the United Nations, but it could be in the IMF, as it was tried early in the century, if the decisions in that regard are independent of the IMF board. No, that's what it was agreed at that time in that discussion early in the century. It was agreed that because otherwise that would not work in the IMF. Let's put it that way, clearly, because the big interest of the U.S. and other countries with creditors will prevail in that decision. Anyway, so those are the recommendations. By the way, today it happened that Project Syndicate published a summary of our views. So you want to be a summary of that views. They are in the Project Syndicate op-ed with Kevin Gallagher and, and Sunat Khan. Anyway, now, one of the big issues, I think, in regard to debt is the effects of shocks, of significant climate shocks. That, of course, again, let's say in the IMF analysis, should be involved, let's say, the balance of payment, but also the fiscal risk associated to those shocks. And of course, they generate rising debts in most cases. So the big question mark is what to do with those debts associated to shocks. I think my view is actually that they should be subject to a global institutional mechanism. And the best that has been created is actually the Loss and Damage Fund of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that fund should be expanded. I have great hopes that in the meeting of the convention, the Conference of the Parties in Brazil in December this year, there will be significant improvements in the financing mechanism of the Framework Convention, because I think they're really part of the important solution in these issues in which there is no possibility of countries to recover the losses associated to the climate shocks. So that will be my answer to those questions.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. And this brings me to the final round, which is more, and you introduces the global governance of these issues. And I would start from the IMF. The IMF has a key role in the G20, in the NGFS. I think also contribute to the coalition of finance ministers. So I'm wondering how you see in perspective the role of the IMF in all these various forums, and if I can be a little bit trigger a debate. So I think given the latest, let's say, instructions, quote unquote, from the big shareholders, how you plan to better communicate on the importance of climate change, how climate change is macro critical. I think this is the important, because this, I think, is the elements that could trigger maybe a compromise in the current situation.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll tackle these separately, and yeah. I'll tackle the second question first, of how to address or be more clear about the macro criticality of climate change. So I think that, the climate strategy of the fund in 2021 that was endorsed by our executive board made the case that climate change is macro critical. And after that, we just went on our merry way because we had established that macro-critical link. We did not then, in all of the papers that we have since disseminated, been explicit in making that macro link since. We've just inferred that people will remember that it is macro-critical. And I think that that's something that we have started to do in our work, is to be much more explicit in showing that there are those macro-critical links and laying them out for each of the specific issues. And it's very easy for us to do. We just did not necessarily do that. So that's my answer to the first part.
I think it's a good answer. Also, I mean, we have been discussing also in this the importance of communication. So it's not just to do the right thing, but to communicate well. And I think communication should be better integrated into the policy making. Just my comment.
I agree, and communication we need to do better on all levels for communication, I think. Personally, in my family, policy issues, everything. Okay, so the second question about like the IMF's role in like all this thing. Okay, so I think that the Paris Agreement and the proliferation of carbon pricing show why international cooperation is important. I think that's. But at the same time, we see that the current NDCs have fallen short. They're not going to keep temperature increases to only 1.5 degrees Celsius, rising above pre-industrial levels. Our analysis shows that there are large ambition and implementation gaps, and therefore the ongoing NDC update is going to be critical if countries want to achieve the Paris goals that they signed up for. So our analysis is determining the gap, but at the same time, it's really the countries that need to take the actions themselves and agree amongst themselves that they're willing to achieve those goals that were laid out in the Paris Agreement. And so we do the analysis, we provide illustrative scenarios. For example, we made a proposal a few years ago about an international carbon price floor, emissions cuts based on countries' income level, what to do, and how much money could be raised if we put in place a carbon tax on international shipping and aviation. But at the end of the day, these are just proposals, and countries need to come together and agree. They actually need to do the work themselves. We think that there could be some plurilateral agreements that could complement Paris and reinforce that work. So we see that in Asia, that the work on ETSs shows some success. But I think, I've pointed out, like, we do these modeling, we do our analysis, we help countries do some work, but we also have a role in this multilateral surveillance, and that's not just focused on climate, but, we have included in our flagship reports, in the Fiscal Monitor, the World Economic Outlook, and the Global GFSR. Thank you, I can't remember what it stands for. Financial Stability Report, we've covered climate issues. So for example, in October 2023, I was involved in the Fiscal Monitor chapter where we were looking at how can spending-based policies achieve climate mitigation goals. And this was at a time where many or several countries were embarking on these ambitious spending-oriented policies. But we showed that without ambitious carbon pricing, it was not going to be feasible. Debt was going to explode. So it's the analysis that we're putting out there to show the implications of the policies that are being taken. But if countries want to actually follow through, they have to take that decision. So I think that, we have different ways to be involved in this international setting. Like I mentioned earlier, the coalition, and I think Pekka is in the best place to talk about the role that the bank and the fund play in that. But we'll continue to play this role of doing the analysis, but then at the end of the day, it's for countries to take the right steps.
Thank you very much. This gives me the opportunity to ask Pekka about the future of the coalition, how this can foster cooperation, collaborations, and how do you see the future of this cooperation? What are the major challenges and how to overcome them?
Yeah, thank you. A few weeks ago in DC, there was a full room around a roundtable of ministers in the meeting of Finance Ministers Coalition. And usually the coalition doesn't give joint statements, but now they did for the obvious reasons where they confirmed their commitment to the work of support the so-called Helsinki principles and enhance efforts to do that. And as I said before, there are two important things. I mean, we work for ministers. Ministers come together in DC with the World Bank and the IMF, providing using their convening power as key institutional partners, and they share experiences and give feedback on where they need help, and we get that feedback. And as I said, through the guidebook, we know what to do. We know what to do. The coalition knows what to do. So I think that's important. We have, even if we have one important country left, the coalition, we have received the coalition has got new members. Most recently, for example, Turkey, which also is part of the Heads of States Climate Club. So there's a lot of leadership around there from different countries. And if you look at the carbon pricing map of the carbon pricing leadership coalition, if I looked at it correctly, there are from G20 countries only 2 countries that are not working on carbon pricing. They are USA and Russia. Even India has started last year to work on carbon pricing. But of course, US has many states that do that, but as a sort of federal level. But I want to come back to one important element, which is part of this momentum that I actually forgot to respond in the last round, has to do with the regional work. Asian Development Bank in Asia has started to take very, very big role in supporting the regional platforms, really bringing the fiscal side to the financing programs, to the strategic context of the country programs, and they really stepped up efforts, and they basically are implementing the guidebook from that angle. And we know from Latin America, Inter-American Development Bank is doing the same, and it has a big sort of impact in supporting that work in this region. Also in Africa now, with the leadership of Uganda, there are many, many important countries like a COP presidency, Egypt, and G20 presidency, South Africa, and so forth. So there are many good sort of signs. There is leadership, and there is a lot of activity there. And the partnerships are important. I mentioned the important role of the bank, World Bank, and the IMF, but there are more than 30 institutional partners, and really how to benefit from that expertise that also these bring at country level activities. So they're on the ground supporting how we use that network. So there are many sort of important, I think, positive momentum. So I would like to mention one last point, which is also coming strongly from my own country and more generally. The private sector is really driving the process forcefully, and it's difficult to see that green transition in the private sector would be cancelled or anything. It is going forward also on that side. But I stop there.
Thank you very much, Pekka, for that. And now I turn to Kevin also, maybe to complement difficult questions I made to Christine, also to you. Because on climate finance landscape, there has been a report by G20 working group, which was quite critical that in this field there's a lot of fragmentation, duplication, competition, different platforms, also at national level. So I'm wondering how you see this and what the World Bank can do to improve and making best use of existing resources, more efficient use of existing, without talking about increasing resources. I think there is scope also to use better what is available.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. I'll take the opportunity to react quickly on the modeling and the communication. There is a communication challenge on the modeling, but I think on the macro climate modeling, but I think there is a substantive issue as well, which is that if you look under the hood of these models, if you approach this kind of a shock in a model where there's an elasticity of substitution that's not zero, and you've got lots of equilibrium behavior, you're already on the road to not finding particularly dramatic effects of climate on the macro. But there are ways, even with those models, to make it a more interesting discussion. One thing we've been trying to do is make a discussion more about plausible bad scenarios rather than type of the average scenarios that often come out of these models. That was coming out in Iader's paper this morning. What's going on in the tails that we really need to look at. And also like the compound nature of the shocks that we're talking about. I'll give one example. California, the news description of that was you had these Santa Ana winds causing wildfires. You look at the sequence, it was actually, there'd been 3 years of heavy rain causing everything to grow, which then dried out in a drought and became flammable. And you had decades of development where people were building closer and closer to this. So it was not just one event, it was several events coming from different sectors, if you like, that then made this thing the catastrophic event that it was. Not something you'd find if you're doing lots of sort of an averaging in a macro model, but really, it really mattered. And so trying to bring the discussion more about these types of scenarios. Now, on your question, and the Brazil G20 did great work, I think, trying to get some concrete recommendations on the table. You're still at the issue that Professor Ocampo talked about, which is these funds, some of these funds are there to be concessional. They have to be highly concessional for certain countries. And so that already gives you a problem with then kind of the mobilization, say leveraging. There was a lot of talk, well, you could leverage these into something much bigger, but there's only so much you can do when you have to be giving grants or ultra-concessional financing to certain countries. But there certainly are things that can be done in that respect. The language of G20 is always that everybody should be working as a system. The MDBs, the funds, all the players should be working as a system. I think the idea that comes up consistently there are the country platforms that you mentioned, and it's certainly a good idea. The best way to make everybody work as a system is for the countries to say to the financiers, you all have to work together. I think there's a what's not to do there. Country platforms have been around for a long time. If you go back to the development effectiveness debate, they've been there. What we found when you looked at the experience in the past, what tended to happen was they would start with high intentions about everybody's going to coordinate around their financing, but you go back a year later, they're basically mission coordination platforms. It's gone to the part of the Ministry of Finance that does international cooperation, and it's just everybody saying, we're doing a mission on this, we're doing a mission on that. But the integration part has been lost. I think to keep it serious, there has to be a policy part to this. So there has to be, you've certainly got the financial institutions coming saying, here's what we're interested in doing in this country. But there also has to be the country coming to say, these are the policies that we are willing to implement with financing to get this to work. And that was emphasized in the Brazil G20 task force on climate. If you don't have the country policy aspect in the country platforms, they won't work, and then over time they'll disengage and become logistics platforms, not really policy or financing platforms. I'll stop there. Nicola.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Jose Antonio for the last intervention. I want to pick up on your extensive experience both in academia and policy-making institution. How you would design the climate finance architecture, the global governance, what is missing? If you have the magic wand, what would you recommend to do? You already mentioned the role of the United Nations, which I think is a valuable contribution, but elaborate more.
No, I actually think, well, I largely discussed this issue in my first answer. So I actually think for long-term financing on environmental issues, because aside from climate is biodiversity.
Yes.
But I think long-term financing should be, let's say, the multilateral development banks, notably the World Bank, which actually all of which are already active in that regard. And of course the UN Framework Convention Climate of the United Nations, the funds they have for mitigation and adaptation, as well as the loss and damage. I think those resources have to be increased substantially. So I hope in every conference of the parties they are increased. So I hope there will be increase again in Brazil this year. And it's quite important because those are the consensual funds that are required in this regard. I will also mention other concessional funds. And of course, for the short-term financing for the balance of payments and fiscal problems generated by shocks, that's an issue of the monetary institutions, which means the IMF and the regional monetary funds. So that's I think the basic task that they have in that regard. Again, in the case of shocks, the loss and damage fund may be required to avoid over-indebtedness of the countries. Now, I actually let me add one particular proposal that we made for the conference of the party, excuse me, for the Financial for Development Conference this year, which relates to the SDRs, the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights are the most underutilized instrument in the international financial system. There are more than $900 billion that have been issued, and my estimate is only 8% are used at all. So the recommendation that we made is actually, going back actually to discussions in the 1970s, is to eliminate the dual accounting of the IMF, which means that the SDRs, which are not used, become deposits of countries in the IMF, which means they can be used for IMF financing, but they can also be used by countries to support the funds, for example, in the banks, in the multilateral development banks, for climate and for development objectives. So that's one particular proposal that we made. And by the way, the one thing that has to be done is something that has been done by the IMF in the current funds, the two funds, which is to guarantee the reserve character of the SDRs, which means that basically those funds has to be overcapitalized so that the countries can withdraw their contribution at any time, so that they're actually reserves of countries. So that's the one point. But I wanted also to refer to fiscal issues. Please. And perhaps my other hat, which has been Finance Minister of Colombia. Actually, let me say, for one of my prides, aside from being Finance Minister, I was also in charge of creating the Ministry of Environment of Colombia in 1993. So I am let's say, an environmentally friendly finance minister. Anyway, I think I mean, there are many issues, many funds that have to be paid by governments. I mentioned some before: adaptation, deforestation, several guarantees. I mean, the guarantee funds have, capitalized by governments for certain long-term investments. And I forgot to mention one which is critical in this country, which is water. How to avoid, let's say, floods, and how to guarantee that you have enough water reserves for the cities, for people to drink in the cities, which is a major issue actually of Bogotá this year, last year. So it's an important, there are important issues that have to be, have to be funded. So essentially you have to have the public sector resources to do that. And in that regard, going back, I think carbon taxes should be one of those instruments. And to, they should be improved, expanded, perhaps as part of the UN framework convention on international cooperation and taxation, which is being discussed now. They could be included actually a mechanism to coordinate the carbon taxes in the world. But also, of course, other resources. And let me say that, and finish with this, another topic which is also for the conference on financing for development. For low-income countries, it has to be ODA, official development assistance. There is no other mechanism that can finance, aside from, of course, from the UN funds. But otherwise, it has to be official development assistance. So the recovery of official development assistance, which is in a deep crisis now, has to be one of the great priorities in this regard as part of the financing of many decisions.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. I think I couldn't conclude better than your last intervention, so I would not dare to sum up, because I think you put all the elements into place, the importance of cooperation and the fact there is not one size fits all, but we need the different institutions, different policies to tackle the many challenges we have been discussing today. I think time is up. If I see is now the time for Fidel to provide the concluding remarks. But before that, I think a round of applause for the 4 panelists.
Well, thank you very much, dear friends and colleagues. As we bring this seminar to a close, I want to express my gratitude for the depth of knowledge shared today and the invaluable insights contributed by each of you. I have the responsibility of giving the closing remarks, and this is particularly difficult because of 2 main reasons. First, the amount of food for thought that has been shared during this very intense workday has been tremendous and complex to summarize. And second, I understand that Nicola was somehow mistaken, because in fact, I am the only obstacle between you and your dinner, so I'll be brief. Let me start highlighting a clear consensus heard during the day. Our discussions have underscored a critical truth. Climate change is no longer just a long-term concern of some scientific community. It is an immediate reality that is reshaping macroeconomic and financial stability worldwide. My daughter is doing a PhD in climate change and adaptation, so I asked her for ideas for this seminar. Her first reaction was, do you really need an international conference to realize what is obvious, that climate change has an impact on macroeconomic and financial stability? Well, we had somehow a big discussion, but at the end, she was very happy with the synergies that she found between environmental science, economics, and finance discussed during the seminar. And I believe that is crucial, because building what Christine described as public sentiment, this narrative, matters to move forward a comprehensive climate action agenda with solid economic foundations. Today's seminar has given us abundant ammunition to create that narrative. Through the sessions, we had advanced our understanding of how climate change impacts key macroeconomic variables such as output prices, while also highlighting its effects on financial and fiscal sectors. The conversations today had made very clear that these issues are no longer on the periphery of economic stability, but have become central to policy considerations. Importantly, as climate risk increasingly intersect with balance of payments concerns, institutions like RFAs, the regional financial agreements, must be prepared to act within their defined mandate and without overlapping with the work of multilateral development banks. This division of responsibilities is clear, and ensuring effective coordination will be critical in managing climate-related financial risks. I would like to highlight the need collaboration and coordination in at least 4 related areas that were clear after the discussions of today's seminar. First, data, information, and knowledge sharing. We should stress events like this to enhance this important part of our cooperation of our institutions. Second, incorporate climate risk into regular macroeconomic and financial analysis. Third, develop technical assistance and capacity building programs to better assess risks and opportunities in our member countries. It is possible to decouple from fossil fuels and still grow. That was mentioned today very clearly. But access to finance is crucial. Around 3.7% to 4.9% of GDP will be needed to tackle challenges from physical and transition risks. Therefore, institutions like RFAs, PDBs, IFIs should be catalytic in the development of markets for green instruments, including investment and insurance markets. Our policy roundtable discussions reinforce the urgency of coordinated action. Monetary and fiscal policies, financial regulators, and international cooperation will play defining roles in mitigating the economic consequences of climate change. The task ahead is clear. Institutions must adapt, policymakers must act decisively, and collaboration must deepen to ensure resilience. This seminar has reinforced that climate risks are now fundamental to macroeconomic and financial stability. The knowledge shared today must translate into tangible actions that safeguard economic stability while advance sustainability. Let us take these insights forward, continue the dialogue, and work collectively toward practical solutions. With strategic decision-making, proactive adaptation, and coordinated international efforts, we can navigate the challenges ahead. I would like to take a moment to sincerely thank the teams at ESM, AMRO, and FLAR for making this event possible. In particular, within the FLAR team, I want to highlight the leadership and perseverance of Carlos Giraldo, as well as the other Giraldo support who were instrumental throughout the whole process. Also, our Master of Ceremonies, Felipe, who was also responsible of the communications team and handled the streaming of this event that has had many thousands of followers. And Jorge Rodriguez, that helped us with all the administrative arrangements. Thank you all once again for your participation. I look forward to future discussion on this crucial issue and the continued advancement of our shared goals. Safe travel, and may our collective efforts drive meaningful change. Thank you so much.